In the summer of 2023, a 22-year-old backpacker named Jeff was out late, drinking at a bar in Kathmandu, Nepal. Jeff had been traveling alone through South Asia over the past few weeks, and he just arrived in Kathmandu from India. So far, he loved Nepal. Over the past 2 days, he'd been exploring all the temples, markets, and food stalls that filled the bustling 2,000-year-old capital. He'd been going out to bars every night after dinner, hanging with locals and fellow tourists alike. Tonight, he'd chosen a bar that was full of people about his age, and the music was all Western pop tunes, so it sort of reminded him of being home. Jeff ordered a potent Nepalese drink called Roxy and struck up a conversation with the man on the next bar stool. He bought his new friend a Roxy as well, and they talked about Jeff's travels for a while. Then someone else joined the conversation, at which point Jeff decided it was time to buy some shots. By the time he paid his bar tab a few hours later, Jeff could barely see straight. He stood up from his bar stool, but he could hardly feel his feet. He only knew he was standing upright because he felt so dizzy. He staggered his way through the crowd. It felt like he was trudging through peanut butter. He swayed a little and stumbled backwards into the group of guys he'd been talking to all evening. They laughed at him, and one of the men gave him a playful push in the back, which sent him spinning into another group of men he didn't know. And these guys did not think the drunken man was so funny. They shoved Jeff back into his original group of friends, but a lot less gently this time. Soon enough, both groups were shoving and pushing, and the last thing Jeff remembered was the feel of someone's fist exploding against his cheekbone. The next morning, Jeff woke up in his hostel bed with the worst headache of his life. It felt like his head had been stuffed in a vice grip. He remembered getting punched the night before, but had no memory of what happened next or how he got home. Frankly, he was just glad to be back in his hostel bed and in one piece, even if his head was pounding. Jeff knew he had some painkillers in his bag somewhere, but the idea of just rifling through his belongings made him feel dizzy. So instead, he just reached for the half-empty bottle of water on his bedside and chugged it down in a single gulp. He felt better for about 30 seconds, but then vomit surged up his throat and he had to dive for the trash can on the far side of the room. He spent the next 5 minutes with his arms wrapped around the trash can, purging the contents of his stomach. It made him feel better, but he was still very achy and nauseous, and he also now had a sharp pain in his gut. It almost felt like he'd pulled a muscle in there or something. Jeff crawled back to his bed and flopped onto the mattress. He decided he would spend the rest of the day in bed, sleeping off this hangover. When Jeff finally woke up again later that day, the sun was setting outside his window. His headache was dull now, and the room had stopped spinning. But the pain in his gut felt sharper, and there was an edge to it that he'd never felt before. Now, Jeff didn't want to be alarmist, but he was all alone in a foreign country very far from home, and so he had this feeling that he should just go to the local emergency room and make sure everything was okay. After a quick dinner break, Dr. Anil Singh walked into the waiting room of the emergency department at the Shankarapur Hospital in Kathmandu. He called his next patient, a foreign tourist named Jeff. Dr. Singh specialized in gastrointestinal problems, and he'd been called down to take a look at Jeff's stomach. He led Jeff to a small examination room, and as they walked there, the doctor immediately noticed the smell of stale alcohol radiating off of Jeff. But he didn't say anything. Instead, once they got to the room, the doctor asked Jeff if he'd been experiencing any symptoms like constipation or stomach distension. And Jeff shook his head and said no. He said he had been hungover and he felt nauseous from it, but that was not why he was at the hospital. The reason he was at the hospital was because of this new shooting pain in his stomach. Dr. Singh nodded and then put on a fresh pair of latex gloves and told Jeff to lie down on the table. After he had, the doctor lifted up Jeff's shirt and instantly saw a large bandage taped over Jeff's abdomen. And then beneath it was a 3-inch long cut with fresh sutures stitching up his skin. Whoever had done the sutures had done a good job, but Dr. Singh was pretty certain this was why Jeff's stomach hurt. He told Jeff that his sutures looked clean and asked where he got the injury. But Jeff looked so confused. He looked at his stomach and then back up at Dr. Singh with this horrified look on his face. Jeff said he had no idea where that injury even came from. He said he remembered getting punched in the face last night at the bar, but had no memory of anything after that, certainly didn't recall getting cut or seeing any kind of doctor who might have stitched him up. Dr. Singh cocked an eyebrow and looked at Jeff like, really? You had no idea you had a wound on your stomach? But as Jeff continued to look totally shocked, By this wound, the doctor concluded that maybe Jeff really was telling the truth, that he really didn't know about this cut. And so Dr. Singh examined the wound more closely and told Jeff that it looked like someone had cut him open, like that's what the injury was, you've been cut. And so Dr. Singh ordered an x-ray just to see what was going on in there. Jeff nodded like he understood, but his eyes were staring off into the distance and he had a totally frightened look on his face. He asked the doctor if it was possible that someone had stolen an organ from him while he was blacked out drunk. He'd always heard that in some countries there was a black market for kidneys, but Dr. Singh smiled and told him that that probably did not happen to him. An hour later, Dr. Singh received Jeff's x-ray, and when he pulled it up on his computer to take a look, he was absolutely floored. And so he rushed back to Jeff's hospital room and asked him to tell him whatever he could remember about the night before. And so Jeff saw the urgency on the doctor's face, but admitted that as much as he wanted to remember, it really was all a blur. He remembered drinking way too much and getting punched in the face at some point, but he had no idea how he had gotten back to his hostel room after that. Dr. Singh was in awe of how drunk Jeff must have been to have basically no memory of the night before. But he told Jeff that ultimately he would be okay, but based on his x-ray, he would have to get in the operating room right away. He needed immediate surgery. Jeff, who was already pale, got even paler and asked Dr. Singh to explain what was wrong with him. What did he find? Dr. Singh sighed, sat down next to Jeff, and then broke the incredible news. The moment those x-ray images came back, Dr. Singh knew exactly what was causing Jeff's discomfort. There was a 6-inch long knife blade lodged inside of Jeff's body. Dr. Singh told Jeff that at some point the night before, he must have been stabbed, and apparently stabbed so hard that the knife blade had broken off inside of his abdomen. And somehow, Jeff was so drunk, he didn't remember any of it. Dr. Singh decided to call the bar, hoping that somebody there would know the whole story. And luckily, the bartender who answered the phone had been working there the night before and had seen the whole thing. Jeff had made some friends at the bar last night, but apparently he had made some enemies too. And during the physical altercation that ensued with these enemies, someone stabbed Jeff with what looked like a chef's knife, and then one of the onlookers took Jeff to the nearest medical shop, which are these 24-hour pharmacies that can be found all over Kathmandu. And so once they got there, the onlooker begged the shop owner to sew Jeff up, and the shop owner did, even though he was not a doctor. And because he was not a doctor, the shop owner, before stitching him up, didn't think to check whether there were any foreign objects inside of Jeff first, hence the knife being left inside of Jeff. And then afterwards, when Jeff was sleeping off his hangover back at his hostel, that knife blade traveled inside of him through his innards until it was lodged deep inside of Jeff's torso. It was a miracle that it didn't cause further damage to Jeff's internal organs as it worked its way deeper into the muscle of his abdominal cavity. And so it was no wonder Jeff was in extreme pain by the time he got to the ER. Jeff was taken to the operating room, where surgeons were able to extract the knife blade from his abdominal cavity. Then they patched him up, and he was discharged from the hospital 5 days later. Ultimately, Jeff would travel back to his home country once he was healthy enough to travel, and although he couldn't remember the most exciting part of his trip, getting stabbed, he would always have the scar as a souvenir. And now, here's our second story, called Look, Don't Touch. On the morning of January 14th, 1996, Alana Rugen carried her 6-year-old son, Jaden, as they walked towards the Tropical Discovery Center at the Denver Zoo. She was eager to get out of the cold, especially since most of the exhibits they'd visited so far had been outside. They'd seen the penguins, the tigers, and the gorillas, but Jaden loved snakes, so the reptiles at the Discovery Center were like the main event. Alana let Jaden run ahead of her as they entered the building. And then after going inside and collecting her son, they went to sit in a little auditorium that normally showed a short reptile documentary. But this afternoon, the movie was turned off, and 2 zookeepers were welcoming a small crowd to fill the seats. After the audience was seated, the zookeepers began bringing out all kinds of snakes and lizards and tortoises, holding them up for the kids to see, and also telling the audience all about the animals and where they came from. Alana watched her son's eyes light up when they brought out a massive 12-foot-long boa constrictor and stretched him out on the floor, his forked tongue flicking in and out of his mouth. Alana was thrilled that she'd signed her son up for this little excursion. He seemed to be really enjoying it so far. Just then, one of the zookeepers carried a lizard into the bleachers so the kids could get a closer look. Jaden immediately reached out his hand to try and pet the lizard, but Alana grabbed him and pulled his hand back before he could make contact. The zookeepers had been very clear that this event was a reptile meet and greet, not a meet and touch. By the time the show was over, Jaden was buzzing. He was jumping up and down and telling his mom all about his favorite animals and what he remembered about each one. She smiled as she led him to the next exhibit, called Komodo Days. It was a limited-time indoor exhibit that had just opened a few days earlier, showcasing 4 of the largest lizards on Earth, called Komodo dragons. Each of the animals was bigger than Jaden, and that was actually still small for a Komodo dragon. Alana overheard someone reading from a plaque that said these animals could grow up to 10 feet long and weigh about 350 pounds. The zoo was hoping to raise enough funds to build a large permanent enclosure for these new arrivals to the zoo. For the time being, though, these giant lizards were being kept in a temporary exhibit, enclosed by a 2-foot-tall wooden barrier, which the lizards were not capable of climbing over. To make sure nobody got too close, there was a line of plants in front of the barrier, all surrounded by a chain and post fence. Alana was more than happy to keep her distance. She had to admit that the Komodo dragons were cool, although their exhibit smelled horrible, like damp mulch and manure. But Jaden was so excited, he barely seemed to notice. Alana stood with Jaden right behind the fence, and from where they were standing, they had a good view into the enclosure. Alana thought the dragons looked a bit like alligators, with big heads and short stubby legs and long muscular tails. She then leaned over and began to read from the plaque of animal facts fastened to the barrier. She told Jaden that apparently these dragons were poisonous and had razor-sharp teeth, and they eat almost any kind of meat, from rodents to water buffaloes. Jaden listened and watched in fascination as the dragons lumbered around their enclosure, their big nails crunching on the mulch that had been put on the floor. He giggled as one of the dragons stood up on a rock and stuck its big yellow tongue out, hissing at the crowd. Jaden was so entranced by these dragons that he leaned over the fence to get a better look, and actually reached towards a Komodo dragon that was only a few feet away, near the edge of its enclosure. And as this happened, that same dragon put its paws up on the 2-foot wooden wall to get a better look at Jaden. Alana saw this and gasped and grabbed her son and pulled him back. All that was separating him from one of the deadliest predators on Earth was a line of decorative bushes. Thankfully, she had pulled him away in time, although it felt way too close for comfort. Alana let Jaden continue to watch the Komodo dragons, but this time a little bit farther back from the barrier. And then after about 15 minutes, Alana's stomach began to rumble, so she told her son they needed to leave now, but they would stop at the cafeteria and grab some food before heading home. A few mornings later, Alana went upstairs to wake her son for school. But when she entered Jaden's room, he complained that his stomach hurt, and he was afraid that he was going to throw up. Now, normally Jaden was pretty enthusiastic about school, so Alana decided he must really be sick. So she told him he would stay home today and rest up, and then she went and got him some Gatorade. A few hours later, Alana was in the kitchen grabbing saltine crackers for Jaden when she heard him cry upstairs. She ran upstairs and found him still in bed, but now sweating with a fever and shivering with chills at the same time. When she took his temperature, it read 104 degrees. Alana was shocked. This seemed more serious than just a 24-hour bug, and so she decided to bring him to the doctor. But before they left to go see the doctor, she had Jaden use the bathroom and discovered he was passing bloody diarrhea, which really scared her. Once he was cleaned up, she rushed him out the front door and sped to the hospital as fast as she could. About 10 days later, on January 26th, Dr. Barbara Raffa knocked on Alana's front door. Dr. Raffa was an investigator with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and had recently learned that Jaden was one of 7 children in the Denver metro area who had been infected with a strain of salmonella called Salmonella enteritis that's commonly found in poultry and other animals. Dr. Rafa and her team were trying to figure out where the children had picked up the salmonella bacteria, which is usually spread by consuming contaminated food or water or having contact with infected animals. The doctor reassured Alana that most people recover from a salmonella infection, but it can be dangerous to young kids. In fact, if kids go untreated for salmonella, they can die. Dr. Rafa had spent the past few days interviewing the families with the kids who were sick with salmonella and had asked hospitals to report any new cases. She had the sinking feeling that this was the beginning of an outbreak, so she and her team needed to act fast to figure out what was going on here. Alana knew her son had salmonella poisoning, but had no idea that other kids were also getting salmonella poisoning too. Dr. Rafa followed Alana to the kitchen, and the pair sat down at the kitchen table, and Dr. Rafa asked how Jaden was doing. Alana said her son was upstairs sleeping and still was a bit tired and weak, but he seemed to be recovering. She had taken him to the emergency room last week, where he was diagnosed with salmonella based on his symptoms. He'd been given fluids and antibiotics, which had definitely helped him get better. The hospital monitored him for a few days until the salmonella had passed through his body. Dr. Rafa told Alana how relieved she was that Jaden was okay. But now she was hoping to try to stop the spread of the salmonella strain before it affected more kids. And so she said she had a list of questions she wanted to ask Alana in the hopes that maybe she could help her figure out exactly how Jaden got sick. Alana nodded and said she was eager to help. Dr. Rafa began by asking if she and her son had gone anywhere unusual over the past 2 weeks. Alana shrugged and said not really, except they did go to the zoo the weekend before last. She said they'd gone to see the reptiles. By now, Dr. Rafa had been expecting this answer. Every other family she'd spoken to whose kid was sick with salmonella told her they had gone to the Discovery Center at the zoo, which made it obvious to Dr. Rafa that this particular strain of salmonella had to be stemming from something in that building. So now it was time to head to the zoo and figure out what that might be. The next day, Dr. Rafa and her colleagues arrived at the Tropical Discovery Center. As the zookeeper led her and her colleagues through the employees-only area of the exhibit, Dr. Rafa felt a sense of urgency. By now, Dr. Rafa had identified 33 children who had contracted the same strain of salmonella as Jaden over the past 2 weeks. And each family had this one thing in common. They had all visited this Discovery Center. And so now it was extremely apparent that something in this building was behind the kids getting sick. And for all Dr. Rafa knew, kids were actively being exposed to salmonella right now. So far, they'd been lucky. All 33 families of the sick kids had taken their children to a hospital, so they were all going to be fine. However, Dr. Rafa worried that eventually, if this outbreak continued, that a family would think whatever was going on with their kids was just a mild stomach bug. And then by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late for their child. She pushed that thought from her mind and went back to work. She had to figure out which animal or exhibit was carrying the salmonella bacteria, and most importantly, how the kids were coming into contact with it. And that was proving to be a real mystery. As Dr. Rafa walked through the Discovery Center, she noticed that almost all of the exhibits were completely sealed off. There was no way for the public to come in contact directly with any of the reptiles or any of their environments. She asked the zookeeper about the animals they used in their daily education shows. She wondered if maybe the kids were allowed to touch any of them. But the zookeeper shook his head. He told her that the public never touched any of the animals because that was unsafe for both the people and the animals. But Dr. Rafa wasn't convinced. She said she wanted stool samples from all of the education animals just to make sure they weren't carrying the salmonella bacteria. She also wanted samples from the rodents that were used to feed those animals, because she was not going to take any chances. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Rafa scooped up a bit of fecal matter from a blue-tongued skink and dropped it into a tiny plastic tube. Then she labeled it for testing back in the lab. Along the back hallway, her teammates were collecting stool samples from corn snakes, the big boa constrictor, and all the other reptiles used in the daily show. And they were making good progress, which she was glad for. She kept imagining a sick child in bed at home, their parents unaware that their stomach bug was actually a potentially deadly disease from their trip to the zoo. She hurried the samples she had just collected to a small examination room down the hallway, an area that was usually for veterinary visits, but that her team was using now as a home base while they examined the Discovery Center. And when she got there, It was then that Dr. Raffa remembered the Komodo dragon exhibit that they had passed on the way in. She had a thought. The Komodo dragons were a new exhibit, and even though the Komodo dragons were kept out of reach of the public, the timing of their arrival and the outbreak of this disease was too close to ignore. Curious, she went to find the zookeeper. She wanted samples from all 4 of the dragons, hoping that her gut feeling would solve this mystery. On the morning of February 1st, so about 2 weeks after Jaden got sick, Dr. Paul Nelson arrived at the Denver Zoo, alongside a small team of fellow investigators from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. A few days earlier, all the samples that Dr. Raffa had collected came back from the lab, and all of the animals were salmonella-free except one, a Komodo dragon. And it tested positive for the exact strain of salmonella that had infected all the children. So now, Dr. Raffa had clearly identified the source of the salmonella outbreak, but an equally important question was looming. How could the kids come into contact with the bacteria that was on this Komodo dragon when they and the public were not allowed to touch the Komodo dragons in the first place? The dragons and the public were clearly separated by a low plywood wall, a row of bushes, and a fence. And so Dr. Raffa was stumped, and that's why she had called the CDC to take over the case. A zoo administrator welcomed Dr. Nelson and his colleagues into the Discovery Center and then led them into a back room where 6 other zoo employees were waiting. Most of them were the zookeepers who worked directly with the infected Komodo dragon. And so Dr. Nelson said he needed stool samples from all of them to make sure that none of them were sick and spreading the salmonella strain themselves when they interacted with the public. Dr. Nelson also said they would need additional fecal samples from some of the animals at the center just to play it safe. And then after that, Dr. Nelson's teammates spread out all across the Discovery Center and began collecting samples of their own. Not fecal samples, but surface samples. They were swabbing basically every surface they possibly could. Everything from the plants to the fences to the mulch on the ground. By the time Dr. Nelson and his team left the zoo an hour later, they had this massive bag full of samples to test. About 5 days later, Dr. Nelson returned to the Discovery Center with surprising news about the CDC's analysis of all the samples they had taken. In addition to finding the salmonella strain in the Komodo dragon stool, they had also found the salmonella strain in a very unlikely place. It was sitting on top of the wooden barrier that was supposed to keep the dragons away from the public. Dr. Nelson admitted to the zoo officials that he was really confused. And so he just kind of began walking around near the Komodo dragon enclosure, wondering, how could the salmonella get there? And right as he walked over to the fence, he noticed one of the dragons walking over to him to kind of check him out. And a second later, the dragon stood up on its hind legs and propped its paws right on the wooden barrier. And suddenly, it all made sense. It would turn out the Komodo dragon enclosure was covered with mulch. The Komodo dragons slept in that mulch, walked in that mulch, and went to the bathroom in that mulch. Then they occasionally put their feet up on the wooden barrier to get a better look at their guests, transferring bits of salmonella-infected mulch and fecal matter onto the wooden fence in the process. The children, meanwhile, were so excited to see these giant lizards that they were leaning way over the security fence and sometimes actually touching the top of the wooden barrier. They didn't know it, but they were actually getting salmonella on their hands. And so at that point, if the kids didn't wash their hands, all they would have to do to get infected with the salmonella would be to just brush their nose or rub their eyes, or in Jaden's case, eat some food with their bare hands. Thankfully, the salmonella outbreak was treated fast enough that all 33 infected children made full recoveries. And the Denver Zoo managed to raise enough money for the Komodo dragon exhibit that they could build a permanent enclosure, this one completely sealed off from the public. It's actually still at the Denver Zoo today, and there has not been a single salmonella outbreak in nearly 2 decades.